scientific history is that I started out in organic chemistry, gradually moved to biochemistry, moved on to plant physiology, went into ecology, and for the last 6 or 8 years I've been working on climate change. The other part of my life is that I have, for many years, also been a musician. I'm a performer, I'm a classically trained pianist, I played trombone and other things earlier. I've been composing for 20 or 25 years and had a number of my things performed. And that's still going on and has led into one of my latest activities, which is a series of cabaret performances where I tell stories about the science-music interaction, the people I've known and things like that, and play the music that goes along with it. So my apology for not having a piano to share with you tonight. But I want to take another twist on the whole story, because I realized at some point that I had 2 passions, the scientific passion, the musical passion. Science has always been the one that's paid the bills, but in many ways music was really where my heart was. And I struggled with how these 2 interacted or did not interact. I struggled with it for a long time, and that's actually where the book came from, because I finally decided after I retired the first time that I needed to understand that whole interaction better than I had. So it occurred to me that writing a book was probably cheaper than analysis, which is the other way you could have gone about the same thing. But what I want to do for you tonight is carry you through some pieces of how these 2 interests have interacted in my own life and where they might apply to other people as well. One thing that's worth noting about this is none of us really live in this world alone. We have friends, we have mentors, we have teachers, we have family, and all of these people come into those stories, however they are made. Okay, let's pick up the story first. About 20 years ago, when I moved from the Midwest to Sacramento, I was coming out of a very strong scientific research background. When I moved to Sacramento, I became Dean of the College of Science. But the other thing that had happened by that time was that my music was fairly well developed, and one of the things I did at the very beginning of my time in Sacramento was to make contact with the people in the School of Music at Sacramento State. So Ernie Hills, the chair of the department, is one of the people on my list. We became friends early on, partially because he and I were both trombonists, but also I was an interesting curiosity to him, I think, a dean in some other field who was actually serious about music. So I had a piece I had written for trombone that he gave to one of his students, and the student played on his senior recital. The press picked this up somehow, and there was an article that appeared, which I'll read you a snippet of because it's sort of amusing. It said, "Music and science will fuse during the premiere of CSUS College of Natural Sciences Dean Marion OLeary's piece, Illinois Triptych. Music Department Interim Chair Ernie Hills says that this is the first time that a CSUS Dean's piece has been performed at a senior music recital." It's a very strange juxtaposition, but okay. I mean, who's going to complain about publicity like that? So I did that. The other thing that happened that was really very pleasant in those years was that my own interest in music had become reasonably public. And I'll come back to that issue later on. And when we did events for the college, fundraising events, Christmas parties or whatever, I would manage usually to sneak some music in. Sometimes I was playing, sometimes someone else from the college, because of course I wasn't the only musician in the college. One year we did a reduced Gilbert and Sullivan. We did the Pirates of Penzance, and that was a great fun. But this was an interesting time in my life because I was still known mostly as a scientist, but my music was very public. I wasn't trying to hide it from anyone. And I'll come back to that issue. Well, I want to jump back to an earlier time. In fact, back into the 1960s. I got my PhD at MIT, I won't bother you with that. Went down the street to Harvard, spent a year in the laboratory of a man named, very famous chemist named Frank Westheimer. Lovely man to work with. Graduate students often found him intimidating, but he was also very thoughtful, very kind, and for me at least, a real mentor, a real help. This was at a time when life was a struggle. Okay, the PhD was done. I was working on a postdoc. I was starting to look for a job. I was trying to make a name for myself in a new field because I had changed from organic chemistry to biochemistry as I made the transition. I had a wife and a new baby. And I was still trying in the back of my head to find a way to keep the music going. Well, I played the organ some earlier on, and once in a while I would get these early Sunday morning phone calls. Any of you who have ever played the organ know this drill. They always come at 7 a.m. on Sunday saying, "Can you be here at 10? Our organist is sick." And so, you get into this, it's sort of a fun routine, it doesn't take too much time. I even looked at some real jobs as organist, but I was very fidgety about this whole thing because, of course, I'm trying to keep my eye on the ball, find that job, make my success, and all of those things. And so I was really mostly hiding the music. At one point when I was thinking about the possibility of actually taking a professional organist job, which is a one-day-a-week job, mostly, I went to Westheimer and I said, I have this problem and I'm trying to think what I should do and I would appreciate your advice. He thought about it. He took his time. He said, well, you have to have a life. Which was a sufficiently ambiguous answer that you could go with it where you wanted. As it turned out, I didn't get the organist job, which was a good thing. I did get a teaching job the next year or so. But this trying to hide the music behind the science has been something that I have seen not only in myself, but in many other people as well. But the next person on my list to talk about actually precedes this time by a little bit. We're going back now to the time when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Illinois. Came from a small town in western Illinois, one of those little towns that time had pretty much forgotten, as Garrison Keillor would say. Got to Illinois. It was good for me because it was a time when science was very much in vogue. Everyone wanted science students. So I fit into the chemistry very comfortably, although I started having problems. When I was younger, when I was in high school, I could play the piano, I could play the trombone, I could play the organ, I could do okay in my science courses, I could do 3 or 4 other things, and none of them were particularly life-threatening. So it was easy. I got to Urbana. Well, college can be life-threatening, as we all know. And the minute you get into 2nd, 3rd, 4th semester chemistry with lots of labs and things like that, you start really getting pushed for time. So I got into the best band on campus. I was in the Marching Illini for 2 years. I was having a great time. I would have stayed with that forever. But after a couple of years, I began to realize that every afternoon I had band rehearsal and every afternoon I had chemistry lab. You can't do it. I sold my horn. Yeah, I still regret that. It was interesting in going back and doing the book, and sort of, one of the things that happens in writing something that is this personal is you relive all these hidden emotions that you haven't thought about for 40 years. And so, yeah, it was a very serious thing for me. Well, but there's another side of the Illinois story that I wanted to share. There was a man there named Nelson Leonard, a very famous organic chemist. He would have been probably in his late 40s, early 50s when I was there. When he was younger, he had been a professional singer. He was a bass baritone. He was nationally known for his parts in a good bit of the cantata literature. Mendelssohn, Bach, Brahms, and several others. He was actually on the national concert circuit while he was an assistant professor. Amazing that he could do it. Well, he did very well. His recordings are still famous. His science is still famous. But as he relates in his autobiography, when he got elected to the National Academy of Sciences, which was when he was in his early 40s, he said, "It's time for me to get serious about chemistry." And he stopped singing cold turkey. Never went back to it. This had happened a few years before I was there, and he and I got talking about this because of the common interest in music, and it was still clear, even after all that time, that that was very hurtful to him. I want to go back for a couple of minutes and take an earlier even piece of my life, because it really fits into why these things work as they do. I grew up in a very small town in Illinois, 1,500 people. Everybody knew everybody. I mowed yards, I sold Christmas cards, I worked around town. I sort of did things. I played the organ in church. So I felt like it was a very comfortable place for me. Of course, it's so comfortable that it's hard to leave. When I wrote the chapter about this in the book, I used the Gershwin song, "Someone to Watch Over Me," as sort of the theme of what that early part of my life was like. There's a catch to it, if those of you who haven't grown up in a small town, because someone who watches over me can get turned into someone who watches me. When I was a freshman in college, came home for a weekend, ran into some of my high school chums, and we said, well, we need to catch up. Let's go sit down someplace and have a beer. Small town, don't forget. Very Protestant. So the four of us got in somebody's car, went out to this country bar out in the country, Ed's Hideaway it's called, it's no longer there. Sat there for 3 hours, we each drank one beer. No one else came or went in the 3 hours we were there. The only other person we saw was the bartender. Next day, went down to school to see my teacher, say hello to a bunch of people. My brother comes up to me with this big smile on his face, and he says, what were you and David Predmore and Eddie Bennicombe and Roger Hampsmeyer doing out at Ed's Hideaway last night? No, you got no secrets. But it was a good place for me. I had a mentor there as well, a man whom I first knew as a farmer, but I ultimately realized he was also an attorney, had been the legal advisor to the State Department of Education. And he really led me along the way of getting me out of town. I'll tell you how provincial it was. Most of the kids graduating from my high school who were good were sent to Western Illinois State Teachers College. And I remember very, very well this man saying to me, why don't you think about going to the University of Illinois? Never occurred to me. But I went, I tried it, it was great. So it was a big transition from that small town, but it seemed to work out okay for me. But I want to move on now to a big chunk of my career. And when I left Harvard, I took a position at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, stayed there for 22 or 23 years. It's where I really made my reputation. I still have many friends there. Some of my kids still live there. So you live someplace that long and you never totally get it out of your system. But it was also the time, as happens with so many of us, when you're still struggling with the whole issue of time. I now have 2 children in the early days. My wife is in graduate school. I, of course, am trying to get tenure. There's hardly any time in the world for music at all. I did buy a piano. I did play occasionally. My children still remember listening late at night as they were falling asleep to me practicing. So I was not totally without any music, but it was very limited. About the time I got tenure, I started feeling like I needed to finally get that muse back in place. So I started playing again. I started taking lessons. I spent basically the next 15 years taking piano lessons and really bringing myself up to a much higher level of whatever. And also started very gradually playing much more publicly. And it's grown and grown since that. But I want to take another tack on the Wisconsin story and tell you about one of my friends from those days, a very famous biochemist by the name of W. Cleland, known to all of his friends as Mo. Mo was about 10 years older than I, but we met very early in my time there. Both of us had a problem. We were sort of separated from the kind of science that everybody else was doing. So we really became very good friends. And over the years, we shared experiments, we shared graduate students, we shared equipment, all of the things that scientists do together. Now, the interesting thing about Mo is that he was also, in addition to being an extremely good biochemist, he was also a sailor. And the interesting thing about his sailing was that he was always relatively public about it. People knew that he was doing that. All of us crewed for him at least occasionally. You knew that you were going to get yelled at because that's simply the way he did it. But it was part of Mo's personality and certainly part of his life. But the other part of Mo, which was not so known, was that he was also a stamp collector. He seemed to have that private passion. I sort of barely knew about it. I'd done some photography for him at one point and all that, but not really very much. And that seemed to be the way he wanted it. The interesting thing about it was that Mo was killed in a tragic accident about a little over a year ago. And a bunch of people who were his stamp collector friends came to his memorial service. I found out not only was he a stamp collector, he was a stamp scholar. He had received several national awards from the Smithsonian for his work on stamps. He had published over 300 articles on stamps, in addition to his 300 or 400 articles on biochemistry. But we never knew about it. It was totally a private part of his life. The other thing that was even more interesting was, in my part of the world, he was called W. Cleland. William Wallace Cleland. We all called him Mo. But among his stamp collector friends, his name was Wallace Cleland. So he even published in 2 different places with 2 different names. I have never understood why he did that, but it was fascinating. Did he have the same protective feeling about his life that I did about mine? What happened to me, as I think you can see, is that life was very private at first. And as I thought I could, without risk, share more of it, I began to. But the lack of sharing, the feeling that you needed to keep that inside, is something that I've really been curious about and struggled with ever since. I was back at the University of Wisconsin last fall and gave one of my performances based on the book, and met a new faculty member they have there, who has a bachelor's degree in music from OLeary, is now a professor of chemistry. I wonder if things are changing. Thank you very much.